I wonder what he did, Nick said. Double-cross somebody. That's what they kill them for. I'm going to get out of this town, Nick said. Yes, said George. That's a good thing to do. I can't stand to think about him waiting in the room and knowing he's going to get it. It's too damned awful. Well, said George, you better not think about it. It's Hemingway Short Story Month. Welcome to the Books of Some Substance podcast.
This is David.
And this is Nick.
Hey-o! Well, we just nailed the intro. Welcome to another episode of the Books of Some Substance podcast. And we're doing something a little different this month as we prepare to read a Hemingway novel in the book club. We're going to do a Hemingway short story every week. This week, we are reading The Killers, a playful noir, which is very dialogue-heavy, has some very Hemingway-esque elements to it.
It's also just ridiculously snappy, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I think that was, we had done, probably 2-3 years ago at this point, but some Sinclair Lewis stuff, and just like that 1920s, it's so witty. There's so many of these like phrasings in here that's like the equivalent of "what's it to ya" and "what's the idea" and stuff like that.
I kept waiting to read the line like, "It's gonna be curtains for you, see?"
Yeah, and like I wanted to kind of rag on it for that, but I realized it was actually one of my favorite parts. Just really like how quickly it flowed back and forth, because it really is like 90% just kind of people chatting and throwing around some of their witticisms, many of them outdated and relatively insensitive. We'll go with that. Yeah. Or fairly insensitive. But yeah, I mean, I think that like, I haven't read as many of Hemingway's shorts. I've read a lot of his kind of longer works, and seeing him kind of just jump into this like quick scene, it's almost just like a very short, contained play.
Yeah, it's like a one act that he wrote after watching a lot of Gumshoe movies in the theater one night.
Yeah, it's like slightly classier pulp.
Yes.
It's got the foundation of that like Hemingway moral that's just like kind of lurking behind it, and you're reading most of it and you're like, hey, I'm kind of having a little bit of a fun time being in this time capsule where gangsters wear gloves and too tightly fitting jackets, I think, with their sawed-off shotguns beneath.
Yeah. But it's got, as you said, it's got that Hemingway-esque sort of heavy, fatalistic dread just sitting over everything. The idea that humans can't really change much of their fate.
Yeah, especially if you're a prize fighter who double-crossed the wrong person in Chicago, I think is probably the underlying thing happening here.
That's right. So that's a lesson for you kids. If you're a heavyweight prize fighter, don't double-cross the wrong people in Chicago.
But I mean, it's hard to talk about this without just kind of going straight to the end, because it's not a long story, but just when they pull together, kind of what we read at the intro. It leaves you with this emotion that just feels so, for lack of a better term, correct.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just it's the wallop. It's like the holy shit moment of like, oh yeah, I guess you better not think about all of the problems, because that is just how you get through. That's how you get by.
Yeah. And again, he did what he thought was the right thing to do, which was go warn Ole Anderson. And Ole Anderson just turned his head, looked at the wall, and shrugged his shoulders, said, hey, it is what it is.
Yeah. There's
something correct about that ending. I think that's a good way to put it, because what else could he do? Nothing.
Yeah, it just resonates. I think there's probably like two levels to talk about this story. One's kind of, some of the things we tipped on, right? It's very quick. It reads well. It's engaging. It immediately puts you in, and it offers kind of this pure sort of moral to it. But then I also tried to think about this story a little bit more as to how is he architecting this? I mean, yes, it's the dialogue, and yes, it's some of those lines that to me seem a little bit funny, but why is there certain details in here? And one of the ones that I found kind of curious, because it almost didn't seem to matter whatsoever, is that when he goes to see old Anderson, and it's at the Hirsch house, I believe, and he goes to leave, and by he I mean Nick Adams, because it's a Nick Adams story, and he goes, well, good night, Mrs. Hirsch, and the woman says, I'm not Mrs. Hirsch. She owns the place. I just look after it for her. I'm Mrs. Bell. He goes, well, good night, Mrs. Bell, Nick said. Good night, the woman said. And that's kind of end scene. So my question for you is, why is that included in there if Hemingway and his iceberg theory and minimalism and all that stuff, why in this 5 or 6 page story, is it even necessary to introduce not just Mrs. Hirsch, who owns the building of a rooming house, but this extra character?
Interesting.
Is it just trying to fill out like the small person, kind of to making it more official? I don't know. I can't put my finger on it.
Yeah, if anything, it is a small detail to have you sort of, if you want, you can think about it in terms of class, right? The person who owns that building is obviously not going to be there answering the door in the middle of the night. They would pay someone to do that. So if anything, it is a little nugget of thought, but it doesn't seem to offer anything more than that.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what I started to piece together is if you strip down all the in-between miniature details of this, you actually get kind of a picture of this small town. And some of the interactions of the people that would come in and ask George for food, and he had to lie and say that the cook was out. In reality, they were just tied up behind.
Yeah.
And as people would kind of get progressively angrier, and they'd be like, well, why don't you get another cook? You're running a place for us to just get something to eat, lines like that.
Yeah, and you have the one guy who comes in, they're like, oh, it's going to be a while. And he's just like, all right, I'm just going to go to the next restaurant. You get the sense of a very working class neighborhood.
Yeah. And they kind of, I think so I read this probably 3 or 4 times. First 2 out of just enjoyment. And then the second 2 out of just like, what else is in here that is actually important? And I think some of that sort of American life-esque stuff that he sneaks in there is actually what colors the whole emotion of it. But it's just not apparent because it's actually kind of pointless in a way. It's not critical to plot. This isn't really a descriptive tale. But these interactions that he buries in the dialogue of sort of minuscule characters are actually entirely responsible for the setting, or at least the background of this entire thing.
Yeah.
And that's my biggest rabbit hole on this story, because it's kind of hard to pick it apart because you have such a pure lesson. You have the bad guys, you have the good guys. It feels so like such a prototype of just these stories of American morals, right?
Yeah. See, my thing that I got hung up on was why spend so much time in the beginning in this diner only to have this sort of resignation by the man, Ole Anderson, at the end. So like the story is more or less divided, but I think the first half in the diner takes up a lot more page space.
Right.
And it's sort of this building of this tension. You're not sure what's happening. These guys they're behaving poorly. They're rude. Maybe it's going to be a stick up, but then you realize it's a murder. And one thing that crossed my mind is like they know where he eats, but not where he lives. That seems odd. Why wouldn't you go to the man's house and kill him there?
Yeah.
But anyway, that was just a minor thing. So I was thinking, why spend so much time there? And again, I start to think of this as something just very playful and fun, almost for Hemingway. Or at least as a reader, thinking about what the writer's doing, it seems very funny, right? You build up all this tension, and then when it gets to the point where, he's running down the street to catch Ole Anderson, he tells him, and Ole Anderson's like, yeah, they're going to kill me. He's like, well, Do you want to do anything about it? Nah, I can't bring myself to get out of the house. Everything just kind of falls down after being lifted up, and you're like, all right. As a reader, you almost feel like Nick Adams. You're like, that's weird. I guess I'll walk home and...
Yeah, I guess I'll leave this town.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's. I think it's actually sort of structurally interesting, like some of the things that he does here. And I didn't find that, again, we sort of made the Sinclair Lewis comparison at the beginning with some of the dialogue. But like I remember when we were reading him, we were just like, man, there's like nothing in here. It's just like a dude complaining, and like, yeah, he's a little bit clever, but it's just not. There's no substance. But in these, you get some of the same sort of funny parts, the emotion, some of the wit, a little bit of the feel for the time period. But then he just totally Hemingways it at the end. He knocks it out of the park. And I think that's the pitch.
Yeah.
Because he's a bright boy, You're a bright boy. What's it to you?
You gotta play the races, bright boy. Join us next week where we dive into a clean, well-lighted place.
If you've lost your way, there's always Hemingway.